typically we don't just have data on the server side when we're building a cloud service for mobile devices. We typically are building applications where we have some data that's living on the devices and some data that's living in the server side, and there's a constant flow of information between the two. So important question is, how do we take data from the mobile device, send it to the server, and using a Spring controller, extract that data from the request, just like we could with servlets. With servlets, we could read request parameters out of the HTTP request object. So how do we do the same thing with the Spring controller? Well, the way that we do this is first, let's say we're going to have a context control object. And it's, as we discussed before, it's going to store all of the context for a user. But let's say we want to allow users to send a search string, so they want to find a specific contact or contacts that start with A or C. How do they do that? Well, let's create a method. Let's say we have a method called search, and search is going to take some parameters, which I'm going to fill out on the next line here, but I'm going to just leave some space here where I'll fill these parameters out. And then within our method, we actually do some work. So let's say, for example, we wanted to have a string, which is the search string. And then maybe we want to have an integer, which is a search flag, which tells us how we want it to match. Do we want to match against the first name or the last name, or maybe we want it to indicate how strict it should be in the match. So how would we go about telling the dispatcher servlet how to map the HTTP request parameters to these individual method parameters for this method within our controller? Well, the way that we do that is first, of course, we're going to have to add an @request mapping annotation to this method so that the dispatcher servlet knows to call it. So we'll just put it under /search. So whenever we see /search in a request, the dispatcher servlet is going to route it to this search method. Now we need a way of telling the dispatcher servlet about these method parameters and how we want it to fill them in. And the way we do that is with @RequestParam. And these are params or annotations that can be attached to individual method parameters. So for example, @RequestParam search would then say go and extract the HTTP request parameter with the key search and map it to this individual method parameter. Similarly, we could say @RequestParam flag, and the dispatcher servlet would automatically go and look for an HTTP request parameter with the key flag and map it to search flag. Now, one of the really important things to notice here is what the dispatcher servlet is going to do for us in this case. The request param flag in the HTTP request is going to be stored as a string. So what that means is when the dispatcher servlet extracts that string, it has to convert it to an integer in order to pass it into this method for us. So the dispatcher servlet, when you map request parameters to method parameters, it automatically figures out what the correct target type of that parameter is in Java, and it will do the conversion for you. So the dispatcher servlet will automatically go and look and say, all right, flag is being mapped to an integer, so I need to convert flag to an int before I invoke the search method with this data from this request. And what's important to note is all of the validation of the type from that request parameter string is being done by the dispatcher servlet for you automatically. And then it's automatically marshalling all of that data after extracting it into your method parameters. So then your method, you can write standard Java code and logic that's just OO code without having to muck around with the request and extracting data from the request and converting it to the right types and handling any errors that occur. The dispatcher servlet does that automatically for you. And that allows you to separate that logic out from your code, which really isn't what your business logic in this method is supposed to be doing anyways. Your cloud service wants to calculate something. It wants to do something. It doesn't want to be worried with how that request got to the server, what format it got there in, how all the data got extracted from it. It just wants to do some calculations on it. So this allows you to simplify your methods and write cleaner, simpler methods by using request parameters and the request mapping to extract that data and pass it into your method.